Okay, shall we make a start? Oh, you can see the numbers keep going up or down, so I don't know if there's people joining or not, but we'll make a start and I'll do the general introduction. So thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Lucy Truman. I'm the founder and managing director of Truman Change, and we regularly run what we call change chats, where we just get a couple of people together, have a panel, pick a topic and have a conversation about it. So it's very, very informal. It's quite interactive. If you want to ask any questions, you are more than welcome to. We do record these for people to watch back if they can't make the time. It records the speakers, so it will only record you if you're talking. And if you want to ask a question without being recorded, then feel free to put it in the chat and we'll pick it up that way, if you'd rather not be on the final video. So thank you very much for joining us. Today's session is all about service reviews and troubleshooting, and sort of when you need to kind of really get to grips with what's going on in a particular service area. So it's less about when you need to figure out how you're going to make the change happen, but it's more the start of, okay, there's something not right here and we need to change and we don't know exactly what it is. And what we're seeing at the moment, and so we work with predominantly local authorities around the country, is a real increase in pressure around budgets and finance. So there are a lot of talk of an increased number of councils likely to be putting in their Section 114 notices in the next kind of year or so. So a huge amount of pressure. Added to that, you know, the budget pressures have been going down for the last sort of 10 to 15 years, and we've got increase in demand. So it's really a mess of, you know, kind of pressures from different directions at the moment. And the other thing that we're noticing is that people are needing to get much quicker at making decisions about change. So historically, organisations may have felt that they had the luxury of setting up big, long-term, transformational change programmes that were council-wide that might take 3 or 4 years to deliver. That is no longer feeling like a viable option for people. So the ability to very quickly, in a sort of short, sharp piece of work, look at a service area and understand very quickly, okay, what's going wrong here and what can we do to either make it better, reduce complaints, make it more cost effective, whatever the driver is, being able to get to that place of doing that quickly is becoming more and more important for the clients that we work with. So I wanted to get together a group of people that have done this in different sectors and in different teams, so that we can sort of see what the process has in common, but also where there are nuances for working in different ways. So I've got a really great panel to share with you today. So I'll tell you a bit about me. My background is, I'm allowed to say I'm a psychologist now because I got my master's results yesterday. So I have, my background is in psychology, education-wise, but professionally very much around change and project management. And I've worked in a range of public sector services. So I've done quite a few different service areas in local government, previously worked for the police, touched on the museum sector a little bit, touched on the transport sector a little bit. So got quite a broad experience, and my specialism is making public services better. I've also got with us today Deborah, who's our Associate Principal Consultant. Deborah's from a housing background, which is actually one of the few areas that I have not worked in the public sector. So I'm learning lots from Deborah at the moment, which is great. Deborah's got 20 years in the housing sector and has got lots of experience in things like compliance, reducing temporary accommodation. She's been an interim chief housing officer and has done lots of these kind of short, sharp service reviews that we're talking about. Housing, again, is another area that's under huge pressure at the moment. So both financially, but regulatorily and politically, it's a really hot potato area. So Deborah's bringing lots of wisdom there. We've also got Michael, who is with us today. Michael is a senior PM at Truman Change. So he's been with us for, it feels like about a year now. I don't know if that's right. Is it, Michael? But Michael's background is in doing project management in local authority, but also police. So he's worked in areas such as serious case reviews, crime prevention. He's recently done a service review in the planning service of a local authority, and also services in the police portfolio. So he's very much in the weeds of getting there, figure out very quickly what's going wrong, what can we fix. And we've also got Tom with us. So Tom is another associate consultant at Truman Change. He's got 16 years local government experience, and he's also currently the vice chair, and I know I'm going to say this wrong, I'm going to try really hard and say it right, of Local Authority Civil Enforcement Forum, who is abbreviated to LACEF, but because I know people on the call from different parts of council, I thought I'd better explain what that is. So he is the lead on debt collection service reviews and has been for a number of London boroughs and Birmingham. He's also created internal enforcement teams and recently has worked on providing feedback on the Ministry of Justice enforcement reviews just last week. He's currently working with us on a piece for the Local Government Association, which is developing a debt maturity framework for councils nationwide. So we've got a real mix of backgrounds and skills here of people that are doing really good work and improving services in quite niche areas. So I'm just going to open out to the floor. Like, what would your first tip be if somebody was to say, right, you've got a new service area, you've got to go in, what have you got to look for? What kind of things would you be looking at straight away? Deborah, I'll come to you first because you've done a change chat before, so you're going to get picked on first.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Hi everyone, thanks for joining. The first thing is, Lucy, to find the kettle, because it will be used an awful lot over the period of time of reviewing. So I think because we've become an old hand at this, the change management, we have it in our minds how the process is to review, but it's very difficult then for the teams to adapt to that. So the first thing is getting to know the teams that you're going to review and what the services are or they should be. So again, we're defining the purpose and we're defining what each of the goals or the benefits are for that service. We're going to articulate again how we benefit from the current model, or can we change it? Again, thinking about future examples as well. Yeah, so that's where I'd start. Kettle, meet the people, and get to know the services.
Lovely. How about you, Tom? Where would you start?
Yeah, very, very similar. Can't recommend enough having a cup of tea with staff in particular. You need to find out what grinds their gears, really. So getting to speak to what I would call your troops, the people who deal with the customers, the day-to-day. It's really essential to find out what hinders them in their day-to-day role. Deborah and I have spoke about this in the past, but quite often, there'll be technological issues and things like this that come to light just from a quick conversation. But I think in local authorities as well, particularly where I've worked, what's really important is not losing sight of that overarching corporate goal. And often in the difficult part is to try and translate that into language that officers can understand. Yeah. So really, that could be something as simple as there might be a corporate goal to, increase, channel shift to a more digital platform, but then an officer on the phone might find it very, very difficult to set up somebody to receive an email communication, so they might just not do it. So it's really about just finding that element, and the goal, what Deborah just said there, is really important. It's do not lose sight of what you're actually trying to achieve, because quite often you'll start off with that in mind, and if you don't keep it there, you go off on a tangent. So yeah, absolutely. The first step is always speaking to staff and finding out what the real issues are.
Yeah. And Michael, you've done a few service reviews recently, haven't you? So what are your reflections on what's a good place to start?
Yeah, I 100% agree with what Tom and Deborah have said there. It's getting them initial conversations in, and one thing I always find really important is the initial kickoff meeting with the staff, and really having that conversation with them. What do you aim to achieve at the end of this? We've touched on the goal, but it's getting them to say that with you. If you had a magic wand, what would this look like at the end of our work together? And that's what I always find most important, because you can keep on coming back to it and really understand what they need and want from the work together.
Yeah, I think it is important to add that, although we started the introduction about there's a lot of financial pressures on the public sector at the moment, it's not always financial pressures that drive it. So we have done service reviews where it has been more of a, we've got really good customer service across the whole of the council, but there's this one area where we keep getting complaints and we need to understand why and what's going wrong. So then the whole framing of this is why we're doing this service review is actually about how can we do a better job for customers rather than how can we save money. So it is important to get that right. Yeah. For me, we tend to sort of think of it as 3 areas that we need to look at. So we need to look at the performance, which is where you look at your hard kind of facts. You need to look at the process, which is where you understand how work flows through the team. And also you need to look at the people. So I wonder if we just chat a little bit about performance first, because I think that is an area where it's really important to figure out how you're measuring and what you're measuring, because it's very easy to make incorrect assumptions about things. My favorite example of this, and I bet it's one that you've all come across, everybody on the call, and do feel free to put your comments in the chat, but I do remember years ago there was a project in a council that I was working in where they were looking at making it faster for the customer services team to answer the phone. So they started measuring, do they pick up within 3 rings? And the performance went up, and they did, and everybody was celebrating it. And then when it was looked into, what they were doing was picking it up and putting them on hold while they picked up the next one. So from the customer perspective, actually the time of getting the problem resolved was longer. And it's always stayed with me as a really silly and funny example. And I'm sure there's another one to do with killing rats in London that is quite an old one, where back in the times of the plague, they started paying to kill rats to stop it from spreading. And then it turned out people started breeding rats because bringing dead bodies were getting them paid. So just really thinking about how you measure performance is really, really important. I just wondered what are your reflections? And I know you're all working in different sectors. Deborah, do you have any funny stories like
that? I got into merging libraries and customer services once upon a time, Lucy. There was only 14 libraries, and I became absolutely fanatical about libraries, to be fair, and realised how librarians were probably the most cleverest people on the planet. But in order for them to log in to their system to do a day's work, 13 systems later, 13. And how is that in any way productive? For a customer service agent to log in to start their day took about 11 minutes. So there's 11 minutes already that we're going to try and capture and save by just reviewing. Why do we have to log into these systems? You know, so that's just a bit of an anecdote, I suppose, from me, is just why are we doing this? Do we have to? It's not because we always have done, and that is an awful, I hear that quite often. It's because we've always done that, and that's fair enough. But there are other ways of doing this, and it's about sometimes empowering that officer to be able to make those changes as well.
Yes, Michael,
to add to that, Deborah, you know, I got a phrase that I use for people like that. I used to call them lifers when I've worked for different local authorities. Yeah. You've always got that one person who's been there for 20, 30 years, and you do hear that quite a lot. Why have we always done it that way? And there's nothing better than actually getting to the bottom of it and actually changing their opinion, isn't there? You can do that, but you just need to find the right way to communicate with them and show them the benefits, really, don't you? I mean, in terms of more general performance, sort of in my area of work, different models for different places. I mean, the one that always struck me as being the most difficult to measure was Birmingham City Council, because it's the largest local authority in Europe, never mind the UK. So when we were trying to compare collection stats for any kind of debt, whether that was council tax, business rates, or any kind of sundry debt, we were struggling to find someone to compare ourselves to. So they often tried to coin this phrase that would become best in class, but I often used to challenge that and say, well, what is best in class? But when we actually drilled down on it, we found a good comparison. We actually realised that Birmingham was like a mini country. It is that big. So the actual national collection stats reflected what Birmingham were. So instead of going against other core cities and measuring our collection stats on that, we often used to look at the national trends and see where we're up or below that, because that was a better measure. But yeah, it's interesting to hear from other people as well, but it's not the easiest thing to measure, certainly not in debt anyway.
No, and libraries and customer services was the first in England to truly merge, and we had no data to compare that to. So we ourselves had to go away and we had to decide and define what those measures were going to be. looking at national separately, 1.5 million footfall in a library. Well, how can we prevent homelessness through that route? And just really, really thinking about it an awful lot and talking about it over the cup of tea, Tom.
Yeah.
Michael, what's been your experience of measuring performance?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of examples where Lucy touched on before that have been working with the planning service in a local authority. And what we found looking at the target data that was coming out was that they were reaching, making a decision within 13 weeks of the planning application coming in, which was a statutory target. However, when you dive deep into the actual information we were receiving, you found that they were actually putting in extensions of time within each of these applications. Actually, I think it was 45% of these applications, and that was because there was delays within the process. Information being held up by management, not getting the correct decisions from the correct individuals. So actually, when we dive deep into it, it was saying that they actually weren't meeting these targets, but well, on paper they were, but actually when you really looked into it, they weren't. Another one was when I worked within the police force. My job was to liaise with businesses from Lancashire Constabulary. So we'd go and work with these businesses who would all of a sudden, see peaks in crime or antisocial behaviour, that kind of stuff. So what we found was all of a sudden we were getting a vast increase in numbers from a local Waitrose store. And we thought, why was the reason of this? What we found when we actually got into the weeds and actually worked it out, they were doing a central kind of push out that they wanted management to increase and divulge more with local police forces. So what we found that they were increasing these numbers, therefore increasing their performance, but they were ringing us for something as little as a 99 bag of Haribo, some kids hanging around outside the door waiting for the parents. So there's other ways. There's also external forces which can, affect performance such as that.
Yeah. So we've got tip 1. If I try and summarize this conversation as we go through into a series of tips. So tips 1 is to kind of start with the end in mind and engage with staff right from the start. Tip 2 is measure the right things, which means some real critical thinking about benchmarking and not just accepting data that you're given, but really digging deeper and understanding that data. And we've got some really good examples there of different kind of equivalents of that customer service example or rats example that I gave, where people then start to work around numbers. The other thing I think it's worth raising is something that I've always lived by since learning about it quite early on in my career, is the whole Pareto's law, which is the 80-20 rule, which is that 80% of your work will come from 20% of your cases. I think that comes from peas, somebody told me, because was Pareto a gardener, and he realized 80% of his peas came from 20% of his pea pods. So it's called Pareto's law. It's obviously not a law, but it's a really good thing to keep in mind that when you start talking to people, often their perception, because of whether it's confirmation bias or general cognitive bias, people's perception of what is going wrong is not always correct. And it might be that they're clouded by something that they feel takes a lot of their time, but when you dig deep, that's actually a minority of cases. So I think there's definitely something around that, of using the combination of data and qualitative, what people are telling you, to really understand the full picture. I do think it's really important. I don't know if you guys have
I'll just come in on that. Sometimes, you could ask the same question to 3 staff members at different levels, and they will give different answers to the interpretation of what their purpose is. And that sometimes, it doesn't surprise me, because our perception is very different because of our neurodiversity, I suppose, and neurotypical behaviors. But Lucy, that's your bag. Why are we getting out of the bed in the morning? What is our purpose to do this? And what is our customer? I suppose we often forget who our customer is and what are we trying to achieve here for them. An example, preventing homelessness, set up a night shelter in a decommissioned nursing home in 6 weeks. Boom, that's a record. But out of that, we prevented 23 people from dying on the streets once it was cold. Forget about the record. I'm not interested, but it's the 23 people, human beings.
Yeah, so that connection back to that purpose is crucial.
Yeah, very much so.
I think, especially in the public sector.
Yeah.
So in the spirit of what we said at the start, which is we need to be able to do this really quick, you'd go in, you'd find your kettle, you'd start talking to staff, you'd get your head around what data is available to you. Another key step in that process, I think, is the understanding of the process. Now, I'm a fan of process mapping, and it feels a bit old-fashioned and it feels a bit boring, but honestly, the art of making something visual, I think, is really powerful. My personal bugbear with it is when it's done on a very internal focus and it's not done with a customer journey map alongside it. If you're only looking at inside the service, you're not really showing the full picture. Michael, I'm going to come to you because I know you've done lots of process mapping recently. So what are your tips about doing process mapping well?
Yeah, well, again, using the example of the planning service, which I touched on before, we went and we looked at the process from the start straight to the finish. And what we did was we went and worked with this team within 2 workshops, got everyone in a room together, and as I say, went through the process from start to finish, but really broke it down, split the process into 4 or 5 different elements and went through it step by step within a group and said, how could this be improved? But also, as Lucy touched on there, don't think about it internally. How can it be improved for you? How can it be improved for that customer looking in from the outside? So this example with somebody who's just put in a planning application, doesn't have that knowledge, doesn't have that the expertise that you have. I say you as in the team that I was working with. Think about the basics. Think about that person who's doing this for the first time, the step that they're going on. What isn't important to you is very important to them. So to really what I did was take it down to the ground level and really split it into really easy to manage chunks and just went through it step by step, and it worked really well.
And I know, because obviously I've seen the report from that then what you did was married that up with the data so that we were able to produce a process map that has like little icons on of there's an issue here, there's an issue here, there's an issue here, which then we can back up with data to say, right, here's a bottleneck and it's 40%, here's a bottleneck and it's costing this many days of time. So I think, yeah, that level of detail, although it can feel a little bit painful, is important. What I will say, though, is, from my sort of people background and focus, although that's a significant resource to do that with the team in the room, from a change management perspective, what you're doing there is creating a shared sense of ownership over improving that process. What a lot of organizations make the mistake of is they get consultants in to redesign the process in some room on their own, and then it's dropped on the team who will fight it all the way. Whereas if you've co-designed that, and the people on the ground know how to improve that process far better than the rest of us do. They know which computer systems are crap. They know which things slow them down. They know where they're having to keep having the same conversations with people because we're not providing the right information. So I think there's something really powerful about doing that.
Yeah. Can I just give a really quick example, Lucy, if that's okay, of the process not matching the particular customer, victim of domestic abuse, phoning through. This is the first time she's going to contact a local authority for homelessness assistance or for advice on what she needs to do. She's got a window of 7 minutes between getting from her home to the closest Lidl. Okay, I'm now going to tell her, I'm really sorry, I can't pass you through to that department because you're going to have to log in and create a user file for the council's website. B, I'm then going to make you fill a form in. C, I might get back to you in 24 hours. Why are we pushing our customers? Yes, digital by choice, I get it. Digital by default, all of that. But can we not just actually take it from a point of view of a customer? She has 7 minutes. The chances of her contacting that local authority again is nil. Yeah. She will return to that abusive relationship, all because our systems didn't necessarily reflect. And you can hear it. I'm a big believer in making sure that our customers are seen and heard.
Yeah,
Definitely, man. I can add examples of that from my area work as well. It often, I call them lifers, don't I? But when you're speaking to the day-to-day staff, it's important to remember that a lot of the services that we all work in are sort of regulated and are statutory services. So you do have laws to abide by, but that doesn't mean you can't exercise like customer strategies to improve them as well.
That's it.
One that always gets me, it's a horrible named one, but there's something for council tax called the severe mental impairment discount. I do think that the regulations need to change the name of that, because it does cover a whole manner of mental illnesses. It could be somebody who's suffering, with just general mental health. It could be somebody who's got Alzheimer's, that kind of thing. But there's a statutory requirement to obtain medical evidence to back up that status. So you have to contact a doctor and they have to stamp, yes, literally stamp a form per the regulations to say, yes, I think this person is classed as severely mentally impaired. Then they will get a discount on their council tax and exemption. So what I found was happening at one local authority I worked at was that, a person would call up. It's usually, if you use the Alzheimer's as an example, or a care home, they would contact, it would be a son or a daughter or a spouse that would contact the local authority, explain what's happened. They might be from a different address, and the customer or the officer would say, oh, well, I can't talk to you, your name's not on the account. What they're actually trying to tell you is that, the person whose name is on the account needs some help. So two things there. It was looking really at, how do you access the customer? What questions are you asking, to try and get that? Can you get the letters of authority done better? But going back to the actual medical evidence, instead of just writing to the person saying, here's a form, pop along to your doctor, we decided after speaking to the staff that a lot of these weren't coming back in. So we actually redesigned it to say, will you tell us who your GP is? And the local authority will contact the GP on your behalf. So it's that little tweak there, not looking at what you're just required to do, but how you can make it statutory compliant, but also more, user friendly in a way, or more customer focused, And there's a lot of examples of that across local government where sadly it's not always as good as it should be.
Yeah, and I think sometimes those statutory rules are obviously important, but sometimes they can hinder that creative thinking. And sometimes we can become slaves to things that were once statutory. So there was something, I know we chatted about this a little bit, didn't we, Deborah, on the housing? I did a piece of work years ago, regional adoption agencies, which was a government-driven agenda to regionalise adoption services, so to stop individual local authorities competing with their neighbouring authority to recruit adopters for children. And that's heavily statutory service. There's all sorts of statutory around it, around timescales and what the process is. But part of what we had to do was, across 6 different councils, map the process so that we could come up with the new shared process that all of them would follow when they were in the new merged service. And even though it was so heavily statutory, there was actually quite a few differences in those processes. So it is worth, and then there were some real hefty debates to be had about interpretation of the regulations as to which was correct and which wasn't. So I think it can be, I found sometimes people are dismissive of process mapping because they're like, well, the process is what the process is and what it has to be, when in actual fact, there is still quite a lot of subjective interpretation that is worth challenge and worth thinking about. And as you say, Tom, that can be your baseline, but that doesn't stop you from improving on it. Did you find that in your planning one, Michael? Because planning is another service area that's got all sorts of rules and regulations. Is there any that don't in local government, by the way? I haven't found one yet, but you can
Libraries.
Libraries, you can do what you
No,
want.
I'm joking.
Yeah, absolutely. We found, as part of going through the planning process, you would have to hit statutory targets. You'd have to consult with certain people over certain things. For example, if the application was a certain size or it affected a certain amount of people, it had to go to committee. It had to, be discussed at parish councils. So absolutely, yeah, definitely.
So any other reflections on process mapping?
Just making sure that we know what the customer journey is. It's really, really, you mentioned your 80/20, but if we don't understand that customer journey, then we don't put the kettle on, Tom.
And that's a disaster, right?
Correct.
So we've got then so far in terms of tips. So start with the end in mind, measure the right things. We've got a combination of qualitative and quantitative measures. We talked about combining hard data with people's opinions. And we've also got the importance of combining process maps with that customer journey map. So our third aspect of what we do is all around people. And this is one that is often neglected. So there's a lot of people, and I think it's probably because of professional backgrounds. So there are a lot of people that are project managers, then there are people that are change managers, and then there are people that are business analysts that are very well qualified in doing this sort of work, but often aren't the same or don't have the same skill set as your changey people. So I've noticed when a lot of organizations do service reviews, they are very factual and process driven, but don't take into account culture. And as the saying, I can't even remember who said it, but it gets thrown about so much, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Culture eats most things for breakfast. And you can design the best process in the world, but if you have a flawed culture in your team where people won't follow processes, it doesn't matter what your process map says. So I was just curious, Deborah, what's your reflections on that kind of culture people side? Where have you seen odds?
Yeah, it can be a little bit frightening, to be fair, because sometimes it's, you walk in and it's very sterile, or sometimes you walk in and it's very, very angry. And you have a chat with some of the staff and they don't quite know why they're angry, but they've just been angry for a very, very long time. And we need to make sure that we're giving the right leadership and we're giving open communication and we're giving direction on a regular basis. And it does trouble me that culture, if we can't change it to better the resident or the better the journey and the service model, then you're right, Lucy, we're just weighing money up against the wall, quite frankly, for a consultant in a flash suit to come in. But where's the leadership as well? Are we growing leadership? What does leadership even look like within that local government setting? It's so important for me when I go in. I offer a couple of people some free coaching sessions, so I can give them the empowerment outside of their work day to actually go and make really big decisions, or even suggest change.
Yeah. And I will say as well, although that was more of a negative example, but the opposite is true. So sometimes you can come across organizations that have really poor process and poor systems in place, but the culture in the team has evolved to be, we don't always follow the rules because we have to do what's right by the customer. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a negative thing when your culture isn't aligned with your processes and your systems. How have you found that people work, Michael, when you've been going into different services?
Yeah, so the one example, and kind of touching on what you've just said, I went to work at the start of the year, really, just after I joined Truman Change, with a large city council that had gone through some very heavy financial changes. And the way that they'd always worked in the past was, right, staff were doing this. And I think that is more of an element I found from going into these different places, that the times are changing. So as this large city council, and that's how I'll describe them, were going through these changes, they were ensuring that they were getting feedback from the staff to see how they felt about it, asking them how they thought the process could work better. And I think that is a change. That is something that I've noticed from, as I say, the last few places, that culture is being thought about more as people go through change. Moving on to the planning side of stuff, as I've touched on a few times, from doing this work, it's blatantly obvious that there is some cultural issues within that team that I've been working with. Some very top-heavy kind of decision-making goes on. And that's something that I look forward to working with them on in the future, and really working with the staff and the team in regard to all that.
Tom, I'm quite excited for this conversation with you because I don't know if I've told you this, but my first job in local government was in an income generating service. And the challenge there, so it wasn't a statutory service, it was a school improvement service. And the challenge there was to create a more business-minded, income-generating culture with a workforce that were predominantly teachers. So they had been teachers throughout their career, and then they'd become teaching advisors. So their whole drivers were about making kids' lives better. And then we had to go in and be like, okay, but we're now generating income. So you can't just run this particular training course if it's not financially viable. There was a lot of work to be done around changing that culture and making it without losing the public sector focus and without losing the focus on improving outcomes for children, but somehow enabling a more sort of commercial culture. I'm curious how, although your service areas are more statutory, but there is something about income generation and debt collection that's slightly different than other areas of the council culturally, I think.
Oh, definitely. I mean, what I would say, Lucy, is that councils are having to be more commercially minded, or more. You probably see it in the news, but some can do really well. You look at Portsmouth and sort of some of the income that they get from commercial developments and things, absolutely. But how do you get that translated to the staff? It's another matter. It's exactly the same. My experience in working for some local authorities where they work in a recovery team, whether that's for 100x council tax business rates, and the staff are scared to pick up the phone and even ring people. They'd prefer to send an email. So I think for me, the communication's key, and the sort of a phrase I always use is a crunchy conversation. You can't be scared to have a crunchy conversation with a member of staff. What that means is that they're probably going to find you quite terse at times, and you need to be very direct at points, even times blunt, but you need to make it abundantly clear what's acceptable and what's not. And what sort of, in terms of staffing and local authorities, you've got different people, different stages of their lives, haven't you? It's about finding that acceptable standard, not the minimum standard, what you acceptable. You've got some people who just want to turn up and pick up the wage, don't you? You've got some people who are young and are driven, and you've got people in the middle. It's about finding that middle ground, isn't it? But in terms of that, I mean, it's difficult from a debt collection perspective, Lucy, because the key is always collect. Quite often the services that I'm involved in prop up the local authorities' budgets, like, council tax, business rates, retention, sundry debt, housing benefit overpayment. You can make quite a lot of money from doing that correctly and doing it right. So really it's about teaching sort of other areas of the council to be more commercially minded and improving their practices. But it's very, very, it's important to know that there are ways in it that you can become more commercially minded. I mean, we spoke at the beginning about the internal enforcement collection team that I created whilst I was at council in Gloucestershire. So we found that we weren't happy with how the external contractors were dealing with engaging with customers on the doorstep. We're talking about bailiffs here, enforcement agents. So when you get a knock at the door, there was a lot of complaints. So we thought, actually, could we do it better than them? And then when we actually looked at the economics behind it, we were flabbergasted at the amount of fees you could get. So you can actually improve the customer element of that from speaking to the staff, getting them on board, and actually getting them to do the same procedures as the external providers would do, and actually retain the income yourself. That was difficult because we had it was four, I would say, I'll call them mature ladies. I won't say they were too old, but they were of a certain age, who were having to deal with the phone calls and knock on doors. They rose to the challenge because we were very clear in what we wanted them to do, and we were very consistent. And we managed to have those crunchy conversations with them, the team at the outset, and find out who the right people were to carry out that function. So it's about being clear, isn't it? And I also think as well, it's important to show and tell what you're trying to do, because quite right, Lucy, you mentioned before about if you just design it in a room and drop it on people, it's not going to work. But if you constantly engage time to time, you communicate clearly, you can certainly design processes that will help the culture of the team, and design, you know, processes that are better for the council's finances at the end of the day.
I do think as well, and actually Amy's touched on this in the chat, that there is something around how politics can drive culture, and particularly in such contentious areas. So, you know, the classic example in debt collection is, you know, the recovery of cost of care fees, massively politically charged issue. Deborah, you must deal with loads of politically charged issues in the housing sector because it's such a hot potato, particularly at the moment, and such a high risk political area. I mean, a literal high risk area, but also politically. How do you manage that? Have we got any tips for how we manage the impacts of politics on culture?
You remain completely impartial to the political regime, quite frankly. Most positions that I hold, and Tom, you're probably similar, were politically restricted in inverted commas. So that's why I don't have social media, because I don't want to be seen to be partial to any particular party. But just to get back to Amy's point and your point, Lucy, I think is around understanding what those politicians want for their resident, and what they want and what they get may be two very different things. And that's the conversation behind closed doors. That is, I can't give you what you want because actually if I do that, it will be illegal. Or I can do that, but it means that we have to take from the homelessness prevention fund, for example, in order for us to achieve that particular want from you. So you have to have that really barefaced conversation with the politicians, including the opposition, about what they want, and do they really understand who's responsible and who's accountable in local government and their constitution as well. Not to bore people on constitutions, but it is really, really important for us to reflect on.
I think, Amy, as well, in terms of how do you get that buy-in, what I've always found is, you know, you will be aware who the portfolio holder is for that service area before you try to make that change. It's about not blindsiding them and just turning up with a cabinet report. It's about educating them. It's about having a pre-meet. It's about being really clear about what you're trying to achieve. It's about also, I think, highlighting the consequences of going with that plan and not going with the plan. So we could do this. I find if you give them options, it's always best to do it that way. You can tailor the options to almost get what you want by wording it slightly differently, and then they feel like they are in control of the conversation. I'm not suggesting you manipulate them, it's quite short of that, but what you can talk to them. They're human beings at the end of the day. So I would speak to them. This is what I'm trying to do. Get them into the office as well. That's the key thing. Get them to actually come in and see what the staff are dealing with and why you're trying to do what you're doing. What I would say is I've worked at several local authorities, one particular one in London, where the politicians were excellent. They would come in, they would speak to the staff, they would really help them. And having that direct communication link with them really, really helps, because when you do come up and present your report, hopefully you do it in person as well, because you can be passionate about what you want and what you can achieve. But once you've done that, you know you've got the buy-in from them. They'll follow that up, and more often than not, their peers will follow suit. So you do get bun fights sometimes between political parties. I found that when I was at Birmingham, it happened quite a lot. You know, even though it was a really good policy, it would get, you know, whitewashed because it was a Labour and not Conservative, and vice versa. But just don't give in, and just be very passionate about it, and just be very key on who you speak to, and make sure that they're fully aware of it before you present what you want to do.
I will just add to that one of the worst experiences I had with something getting thrown out at a political level was not because of between party politics. It was actually internal party. So one party, and it was a London borough, had split almost into two halves, and then they just couldn't agree on anything, and it does get frustrating. But I do think it's one of the things that makes local government really interesting, because we all have to, once you get to a certain level in it, you have to become very accomplished at navigating these tensions, and coming back to the customer, the resident, you know, the service user, whatever terminology is right in your organisation. It's coming back to that as much as you can. So we've talked a bit about, we said for culture, good leadership with that resident and customer focus. We've also said the importance of understanding the culture to know what will and what won't work. So we talked about their decision-making, risk appetite, politics. Is there any other aspects of culture that people have come across that's been really crucial as part of a service review or identifying problems?
I can answer that. I think what I find really important is just actually feedback for staff as well. So quite often we don't praise good performance as much as we should in local authority. You find that instead of the carrot and the stick, but quite often if things are going wrong, you know, the phone calls are up, the collection rates are down, you get berated for it politically and operationally. But the importance of creating a good feedback culture. One good example I've seen of that was when I worked in Gloucestershire, a staff-led feedback scheme. So you could actually nominate someone who you thought done a good job, and they would go into a draw and potentially win a shopping voucher for that. What that did was actually, well, it's peer-to-peer recognition as well. So it's not just your manager saying you've done a good job, it's the person who sits next to you does the same job thinking you've done something really well. So I think that's a key aspect we haven't spoke about yet, is actually rewarding good performance and giving positive feedback. It doesn't always have to be a shopping voucher as well. It can just be delivered in a one-to-one conversation with a member of staff, but making sure that you know when they've done well, tell them they've done well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one example from just, it kind of leads on from what Tom said, to be fair, was a lack of feedback, and also there was examples of, you know, an application getting to the end of the process and management thinking, it's not right, I'll finish this, I'll take over this, I'll start again, rather than liaise with the person and say, this is what I'd have done differently, now go and, you know, do that. As well, it's cultural issues I've found is a lack of development opportunities for staff. You know, where can I, especially in a time in some areas where, you know, vacancies and recruitment is quite difficult, you know, how can I develop my staff? What can I do? I know what I'll do. Let's have them shadow me doing this. And then next time they can do it. And that, I think, is a key way to try and improve culture, and just by developing your team itself.
Yeah. So culture's my cup of tea, as most of you know. We consider culture on the definition, which I think came from Edgar Schein, which is that it is a cascading of messages around the organisation. And when you think of it in those terms, and then you think critically about how messages are cascaded around, and I don't mean basic comms, I mean when you say, right, we have to have a weekly meeting and it's 3 hours long and it's in the office, but I want you to be more agile and work with other departments, but we're not going to invite any other departments to that weekly meeting. It's looking for those contradictions of where, when you are saying one thing, but you're also communicating a message in another way. So we look at that through the lens of systems and processes communicate a message. So if your IT is really difficult and you've got to log on to, was it 13 systems in a morning in order to do your job, you are not communicating a message of, we care about innovation and efficiency. We look at behaviours, so that's where it's your leadership behaviours. So like the example Michael gave of when it gets to a certain point, managers kind of take it off staff. That is communicating a message of control and a lack of trust. And then we also look at habits and routines and rituals. So they are things like what meetings you put in place, what stories you tell in the organisation, the language that you use. So I remember once working with an organisation, I can't remember which one it was now, but the story that was often told is, but what would this look like in the Daily Mail? Now, that's not a bad sense check for some stuff, but it can be a terrible sense check for others. And what it's communicating is this constant message of fear, of scrutiny, of, you know, what if we get this wrong, which then inadvertently hinders any kind of innovation or risk taking. Now, none of those things are necessarily right or wrong. It may be right to have a 3-hour weekly meeting in your organization. That may be right, but it's about applying that conscious, critical decision making around those things, because the saying I always come back to is we are all creating and building culture every second of every day. It's whether you're doing it on purpose or by accident. So if you are not thinking about it, you're probably doing it by accident, and you're probably communicating all sorts of mixed messages. But we don't always necessarily do it as part of a process review, depending on the time and the budget. But we do something called culture mapping, where we will go in and run workshops, and we'll draw out whatever those examples are in that particular team or organization, to enable us to hold that mirror up and say, this is the culture that you are communicating. Is that actually what you want it to be or not? And I think that is powerful, because it's full of blind spots, and we've all done it as we don't know what we're doing. And I actually saw something recently saying it's quite toxic to reward your staff for working outside of core hours or long hours, and I do that all the time. Like, if we've done a bid and everybody's had to work late to get it done, I'm like, thanks for getting it done. Now, measured and not doing that too often, that's probably the right thing to do. I feel like we should thank our people for going above and beyond. But if that's the only thing you're ever rewarding people on, then you are communicating a very different message. So it's that constant self-reflection, I think. I don't know if anybody's got any examples of where there's blind spots where managers have completely inadvertently been driving a certain set of things that they had no intention.
I'm not sure there's many examples I'd be willing to share, to be honest, because
without names,
my managers would what I was talking about. So yeah, it's a difficult one. But yeah, I mean, it is hard, isn't it? I did speak about it before, but it's about making sure that you reflect those corporate objectives and how you embed that in the culture for the staff. And quite often you'll find that the managers are told it will say they'll set objectives for you, we'll say, for the year, and it'll just be a copy and paste from theirs, and that really makes you look and go, well, what's that about? My objective is to make sure we have 95% collection of this debt next year, but is that personable to me? Does that reflect what we're trying to do? That might be a corporate aim, but it's not what I need to do to facilitate that. So that's some examples I've seen of that, where the manager will say what they need to say to their manager, but then when it comes to actually translating that to your staff and making sure they get the buy-in, or even yourself, it's not always forthcoming. So they will preach what they want to do, but who makes people accountable for that? It can just be a simple thing. The thing that I've done before with my managers, actually jumping in on a team meeting, even though you're not required, just to make sure that the right things have been said, and if the wrong thing is said, you're there to actually do the good straight away and tell them. You can honestly say that could be a bit of micromanagement, but at the same time, you don't do it all the time. You just pop in every now and again and make sure things are being translated correctly. And I can't stress the importance of that. Is you will, in a local authority, you're politically driven. You've got mission statements. It's making sure that you communicate that effectively to your staff and not just doing a tick box.
I think one that just jumps out at me very quickly is when I was a police officer, which is a cultural nightmare anyway, like without diving into too much detail, is false promises was a big one for me when I was within the. It was, you'd be 1 week you'd have a conversation with management about, I'd especially coming in as a trainee as I did at that time. I'd like to go and shadow this. Oh yeah, absolutely, you can do that. And then, yes, obviously, in some cases, emergencies happened and it wasn't possible. But other cases, it was, oh no, we didn't have that conversation. And it was just so false and just, as kind of Tom touched on, really, telling you kind of what you wanted to hear, but not kind of leading forward with it.
Oh, tips So we've got start with the end in mind, which is basically start the process well. Measuring the right things. So whether that's thinking about your benchmarking, that critical thinking about what it is you're measuring, that combination of qualitative and quantitative stuff. So yes, use your measures, but also listen to what people are telling you and try and make sense of those two together. Do process mapping and combine it with your customer journey map. Good leadership, which is resident or customer focused, and understand the culture in order to know what will work and how it can be improved. And the things we talked about there, decision making and risk appetite, politics, feedback, development, staff morale, and that whole mixed messages thing. So do we feel like that's a good summary? Have we got any other key hot tips in the next 4 minutes from our panel members? Pick your favorite tip. Come on, Deborah, you can go first. What's your
It has to be Yorkshire Gold tea bags, Lucy, end of.
Okay.
No, we forgot about training needs, looking at the training needs of the service as well, and making sure that we're segmenting our budgets effectively. Another thing for me is talking about our budgets from a senior point of view with our junior staff. I think it's really important for them to know how money is spent and the public purse at that. The majority of times the data or the systems that they're using or the information that they're putting into a system is actually going to fund us the grant to pay for reducing temporary accommodation as an example. So why aren't we including them in understanding how that money is being spent?
Yeah,
it's not a secret.
No. Okay, brilliant. So that transparency and involving staff and the training needs. Tom, what do you have?
I think local government holistically like to shout about the things they've done well. So don't be afraid to speak to other local authorities and see what they're up to. A good example of that, even the local government association or the Crown Commercial Services are good examples of where you can speak to people and get best in class advice. But also a little thing, I mean, one thing that annoys me, sort of grinds my gears a little bit in local authority is when you do tenders for services like enforcement providers and things like that. So a lot of local authorities will just go down a particular route and just, do a full-blown tender with like the YPO or something like that. But they're not really in the know that you can actually just join a government framework now and do a direct award. It's painless. You don't have to do interviews. You don't get legal challenges. You sign up to a framework. You sign off a call for agreement. You can pick and select who you want. So it's really just about broadcasting what you're doing well, but always look, because you've got institutions like LASEF, the IRRV, parking, the British Parking Association, things like that. You can see amazing examples of what's going on, and just read up, because you can use Google now and you can find lots of things very, very quickly. So don't be afraid. If you're stuck on something or you've got an issue, don't be afraid to ask, is my advice.
Michael, what's your final hot tip?
Yeah, I'll just give a quick one. So my one is get staff on board. 100%. It's a massive thing. When the workshops I've been in, when staff have come and sat there and just been like, oh, they come into, what's happening here? Why am I in this room? Ensure that the messages are passed on to them before, ensure the benefits of this, because people think they're coming in, what's going to happen to my job? Am I going to hate it going forward? Am I going to lose my job? Is something we've had. So ensure that staff are fully on board, fully understand why they are there, and fully understand the benefits of a service review.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much to all members of the panel, and thank you to everybody for joining us. Our next change chat is in January and is on, we think it's going to be on project delivery, but we do have a planning session, a team away day next week, I don't know, soon, where we're going to decide for sure exactly what we're going to be doing, but it will be something public focused, change focused. if you would like a chat with me or with any member of the panel, if any of those particular service areas is something that you're wrangling with, you've talked about, then do drop us a message, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one in January.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you, Lucy. Thank you, everybody.
Cheers.
Cheers.